We're ready to go for today. We're going to be talking a little bit about a community ecology. I made a lecture of brevity because I figured we had a chance of having a snow day. And so we're going to lead into a little bit more of the experimental data. I don't know if you're the type of person who likes to take a hint about, like, oh, I've noticed we've been doing a lot of this experimental data interpretation. I wonder if that'll ever show up on a test. But we're going to do a little bit more of that. We did some yesterday. We'll do some more. We've been looking at a lot of data and thinking about experimental hypotheses. But we're just going to talk about a couple of discrete things with community ecology. The reading you should have hopefully already did for the last test. And so we're going to get into it here. The community ecology, it's interesting. Cal already was like, oh, wow, we're moving up because we started with individuals, and then we looked at population dynamics, which is how many organisms of the same species are in a space, and then we talked just a little bit about community, but that interaction between species is really where we're headed, and trying to understand the complexity of all the relationships and how the relationships matter, and the dynamics of the relationships help us understand the composition of an overall ecosystem. So let's get into it. Barry Commoner, by the way, outstanding ecologist, died a couple years ago, but many great texts, was really a revolutionary in ecology. If you ever seen his writing, I think you guys would enjoy it. Here are our objectives today, pretty discrete stuff. I want to make sure I land and pause on biodiversity. We've talked about it several times. I think everybody has a basic working knowledge of the terminology, the word biodiversity, but I'll give you some specific stuff, and we'll talk about a few of the key parameters that we'll come back to many times. Then we're going to look at these species interactions when they're negative, when they're positive, when they're neutral, from every which way, and then we'll just mention keystone species. I put it on here, but really that's from our what we did the other day. So I put it on there, but we won't really talk about it as much today. Here we go. Lots on this slide about biodiversity, but I want to call out a couple key things here. And the information I put on here, I put on for a very specific reason. So the key terminology, biodiversity, which we'll use all the time, is this term that's used to describe all of the variety of life on planet Earth, which is, and by all of it, I mean all of it very comprehensively. All of it. It's used to refer to all of the species in one region or ecosystem. But there's two attributes of biodiversity that matter whenever we get to the math. And I want to give it to you now because we're going to look at it again in a little bit. So biodiversity, the traditional thing that we think of is I'm going to go into a space, whether that space is the earth or an ecosystem or just a small sampling of soil. The first attribute of biodiversity is it's the number of species. So if I go into a count and tally it all up, the total number of distinct species, that's one major attribute of biodiversity. And so here, when we're talking about biodiversity, referring to every living thing, our minds usually think of the things that we can see or the things that we typically pay attention to, and there's this really big bias in human society to pay attention to the things that are cute and cuddly and are in the zoo, but those aren't always the species that matter the most, and we really want to try to understand every living thing. So it's plants, bacteria, animals, humans, all of it, every single living thing. So if we tally that all up, the number of species on planet Earth, if we make our space the entire planet, it's about 8.7 million species. It's a lot. There are probably a little bit more. But one of the things that's really interesting is, in this count, we do give a bias to the plants and animals that we've been able to discover, which are kind of large organisms. One of the things that we've greatly ignored in our biodiversity indices or our counts is, well, how many microbes? And that's really difficult to get a finger on because of two reasons. We don't have a really great way to define a different species. So, for example, E. coli is a really good bacteria to look at. Two strains of E. coli bacteria can be as different genetically by 30-40%. But two species of birds, it's 0.3%, and we've got a different species. So part of it is we just don't really know how to define species very well when we're talking about microbes, but also they're so small and we couldn't get a good number. But most people who study this say we're on an order of magnitude much larger than the 8.7 million. So the number of additional microbes is probably 80 million or 800 million or some magnitude greater than that. But we know about 8.7 million species of the things that are easy to count. And even of the things that are really easy to count, insects have been described as about 1.2 million, so over 10% are insects. So when we think about our food chain and our food web, over 10% of the organisms are scavengers, decomposers, detrivores. Healthy biodiversity is really key, and in this class, whenever we talk about an ecosystem, we're always going to characterize higher biodiversity as a good thing and lower biodiversity as a bad thing. And so anything that causes a drop in biodiversity is negative, and anything that causes a bump in it is going to be positive. For these reasons, because we're usually thinking about ecosystem services, and if we look at this, look at the services. I just called out a few that I could think of that are really key. Ecosystem services provided by biodiversity, protection of water, soil formation, soil fertility, cycling of nutrients, movement of matter and energy, contribute to climate stability, that's carbon sequestration like we saw in trees, but it could also be in soil, maintenance of the ecosystem, recovery of the ecosystem in unpredictable events. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But biologic resources. So, wait, let me pause here. So if we look at these, insects, microbes, fungi, soil formation, insects, microbes, fungi, nutrient storage, microbes, fungi, recycling, breaking down of pollution. All of these are these organisms that are kind of small. So our bias to pay attention to the cute, cuddly things that are easy to count kind of does us a disservice, because some of the most important organisms, species in the ecosystem, when we think about biodiversity that provide valuable ecosystem services, are all these small things, microbes, insects, fungi. The next one, when we look at biological resources, so less about ecosystem stability and things that we've actually discovered, what you'll notice is it's a lot of plants. Food. Primary producers produce crops and also produce food for lots of animals that are eaten. Almost every medicine that's ever been discovered and pharmaceutical drug is some chemical element that was discovered in plants. Wood products are, of course, made of plants. Textiles, breeding stocks, population reservoirs, future reservoirs, diversity. The diversity of plants is really high here. So when we think about resources, plants and sustainability really show up here. And then we have social benefits like the study of biodiversity and all of these things. It's jobs for research, education. I would consider myself as a person who benefits socially from biodiversity in my job as a teacher. So all of these things. So we've given a big emphasis to the count of species, but I also want to call out something that helps maintain biodiversity and health in the ecosystem, and it's the second attribute of biodiversity, which is the evenness. So if I have 50 species and there's 5 of each of those species, it's very even. And if I have 50 species and there are 5 of a bunch, but there's 5,000 of 2 of them, it's very uneven, right? So the more even the species, and the higher the total count, these 2 things go into biodiversity. And we're usually going to, in a little bit, we'll actually do some work with this mathematically, but we're going to define that as the total biodiversity, which is those 2 things over an amount of space. And so we'll actually get a discrete number, which will help us make comparisons. And so if we can do comparisons and say the biodiversity of place A is this and place B looks like this, it helps us do a quick understanding of the ecosystem services and the health of the ecosystem, because higher is always better and lower is worse. Does it make sense? Feel good? Me too. Me too. All right, let's start to look at community ecology, and actually we've already dabbled in this a little bit. We just haven't called it community ecology, but we're going to look at some of the other relationships that we don't know very much about. And synecology is another word for community ecology, but it's basically just the study of the interactions between species within community within an ecosystem. I want to pause here and do a little data work, and we'll spend a couple minutes looking at this, and it's a good idea to try to pen an answer. I felt like people had misunderstandings on the last assessment. The key thing that was missed the most was related to resource partitioning and competitive exclusion, so I wanted to stop here and spend a little time. So the first thing is, here are two species of bacteria, and then they show the trends. And then I put together some data, and I want you to notice that this data set corresponds with the trends you see here, but the data don't perfectly match. So these are from different experiments. This shows the trends, but when we look at the data, I'd like you to look at the actual data set that I provided here. So, P. aurelia on the top, this is what its growth rate looks like, intrinsic for a while, eventually limited. P. caudatum looks like this. Similar trends, different numbers, and when we put them in the same space and grow them together, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. So P. aurelia here in orange, and P. caudatum here. Here is the data set. So what I want you to do is draw a quick conclusion about the limiting resources and competition based on the data. And then the second thing, determine the carrying capacity for each. And for number 2 and number 3, sorry about the typo right here, use the data set. Or for number 1 and number 2. The evidence you should cite is from the data set. We'll spend a couple minutes just looking at this, then we'll talk about it together.
Okay. Draw a conclusion about the limiting resources. Okay. Well, we know, I think we have to define carrying capacity by the individual ones.
Yeah.
Because that's...
You can clearly see the carrying capacity lines.
Yeah.
Both for them.
Yeah, and then limiting resources and competition. Clearly they have the same limiting resource, or else.
Yeah.
So
the blue one want to go down.
starts out about the same thing initially until they
So clearly
then
resource partitioning is not really occurring here because there isn't a whole lot of sharing going on.
Yeah.
determine the carrying capacity.
Also, P. aurelis is a lot more competitive than the other one.
Yeah.
Because they're like driven the other one out of their zone.
Seems to be right around
And they didn't partition the resources because
Yeah.
of like
395-ish for the formula for the remember it's better than 90. Would you agree? I get that. Yeah, exactly. Is there competing for resources?
All right, let's do it a little bit. Let's talk about number 1 first. So when you look at this, what are some of the major things that we can conclude? There's one big major point, but there's a couple other minor ones that we can look at here. Yeah, go ahead.
On the bottom right, at 9 and 10 days, you can see that the catacomb one is at 0.
Yep.
And they're grown together, so you know that the other one is more can use the resources.
So this one is flourishing, and this one is absent by the time we get to the 9th and 10th day, which is telling us something about the inherent value for this one to compete. P. aurelia seems to be a little bit more savvy in this environment. Go ahead.
It also confirms that they have the same limiting resource and that they influence each other.
Great. So we know that they must have the same limiting resource, and competition over that limiting resource is driving the response in the environment, which is this thing that Henry just mentioned, that this one is competing well and this one is competing poorly and eventually is absent in the environment. What else can we see? What is that an example of?
The competitive exclusion.
Competitive exclusion theory, which tells us what? If we think about the definition real explicitly.
Like two species can't coexist in the same space when they have the same.
And they can't coexist at the same space. So this is a perfect example, right? They can't coexist. This one ceases to exist. This one is flourishing, right? Very good. What else can be concluded? Because there's more. That's paying attention to one of the things. But what else can we see? And we can use information from number 2 to help us draw out one of the other major conclusions. What else is here? What other conclusions? What do you see about the carrying capacity?
It's different for the two species.
It's different for the two species, yeah? Okay.
They both decrease when grown together.
Yeah.
Okay, good. 2 things. So when they're grown together, the carrying capacity for each is lower. And then the other thing that Greg said is the carrying capacity for each is different. So when they're grown in isolation, this one can carry about 380 and the other one, or almost 400. The other one tapers out at about 90. So what does that tell us about resource use?
Could you say that the not the P. aurelia, I don't know how to say it.
P. cotidum?
Yeah, could you say that it needs more of the limiting resource than
For
the
sure,
P.
right?
aurelia to thrive?
It needs more of whatever the limiting resource is. So this one requires more. And then when they're grown together, the carrying capacity for each is decreased. Great. What else can we see?
Would there be enough evidence to say then that the P. cotidum is a specialist while the Aurelia is a generalist?
There's some indication that that might be true, so this one is more likely to survive, which generalist has higher in real-time adaptability to the ecosystem. So it might be slight, and we don't have quite enough information, but it's something that we could try to tease out with further experiments for sure. What else? Anything else? Yeah.
I guess since PRI is more efficient with its resources, it was able to grow in larger numbers and sort of cut out the P. cotidum.
So the idea that the reason that this one outcompetes has something to do with resource efficiency, right? And you can tell by the population, and it's tied to what Greg said about, well, this one needs, P. cotidum needs more total resources to survive, right? And so it's the example of if it's food or whatever, the person who has to eat more is probably less likely to survive, yeah? So we see quite a few things here. The competitive exclusion principle, what I really like about this is, in this experimental trial, we're highlighting the truth of the competitive exclusion principle, which is true always in ecology. In this one, we're showing resource partitioning. So when we put them in spaces, physical spaces that are different, there's enough resources for both of them. And in this case, they're not limited by the competition. They're limited by whatever is the resource. So resource partitioning here, this is an example. This is an example of competitive exclusion principle. It's a nice study that highlights both of those ecological laws. Feel good about it?
Whoa, we have an eraser now.
I know, right? I stole this from the math department. That's pretty nice. It's real nice. I feel good. All right, great. I wanted to tease out 2 specific things here before we look at some of the other relationships. The first is because we had a little bit of trouble on this, and the examples that people were giving me it makes sense because this is how I talked about it in lecture with the birds. But when we look at resource partitioning and we're saying, well, there's not enough, so usually they divide the ecosystem into different niches, we actually have many different examples. So the spatial resource partitioning is like the warbler example, where some are eating berries here, some are eating berries there, and there's enough of those resources in the environment. But these other two things also exist. So morphological means that the species evolution has produced different traits over time that allows certain species to have access to certain resources. And so the partitioning of the resources is done because of that access to those resources. The classic example is the one that drove evolution, that was at the foundation of the origin of species, different bird beaks. So bird beak allows you to have this seed versus that seed. Suddenly the resources are divided, right? Another is temporal resource partitioning. Birds exemplify this also really well. So right now we have dark-eyed juncos in our yard eating seeds and eating berries. They're not there all year. And during different times of the year there are other birds there. But there's enough resources in our yard ecosystem for all those species because some species are present at one time of the year and other are at another. So spatial and temporal, but also morphological. So here are some other just things to have in our mind when it comes to resource partitioning. Because of the morphological, because species interactions drives survivability of species, we see morphological developments taking place over evolutionary time in a lot of cases. And so this is not hard to get your mind around. You've thought about this or seen examples of this your whole life. But species develop these different mechanisms, and they really align into about 4 different categories. So chemical is some type of morphological or some type of development through evolution for toxicity or distaste, and it usually is a defense against predators. Another is morphological, so that's some kind of mechanism, spines of a porcupine or spike of a stingray, etc. Behavioral, animals either attract less attention, so a good example is movement or hiding, but sometimes it's actual aggressive behavior. So you can think about like a rattlesnake or something that's giving signs of aggression that's like, whoa, back off. And then the last is mimicry, things that weren't able to get it done up here, fake it. And they copy somebody else. So you see this a lot in the insect world, snakes, etc. Defense mechanisms. What time do we go till today?
35.
35. Beautiful stuff. 2 more quick things. I'm going to show a little film. One of the things that we've seen when we talked about this before is the more resources, the more niches, the more biodiversity because of resource partitioning. And so we're going to look at a couple examples from the coral reef because it's one of the most biodiverse places. It has a lot of ecosystem niches, so it's a perfect example for some of these complex relationships. And we're going to look at these: mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and competition. The video is a little elementary, but it's not insulting.
Beneath the ocean waves, and you'll find a bright, bustling city, full of diverse residents swimming, eating, and sharing homes together. At the California Academy of Sciences, our mission is to explore, explain, and sustain coral reefs, like this one in the Philippines. Each of the thousands of species that live here have their own unique role and place within the ecosystem. But it's not all just predator and prey. The relationships between these species are as diverse as the ecosystem itself. In this video, we'll investigate the following key questions. How do species interact on a coral reef? What are the effects of abiotic and biotic factors? And how do these interactions influence patterns of distribution and abundance within the ecosystem as a whole? Take, for instance, this bubble-tip anemone. Notice anything strange? Instead of avoiding its stinging tentacles, the fish seems to be relaxing in them. These 2 reef residents have formed what is known as a mutualistic relationship. In exchange for defending the anemone from predators like butterfly fish, the maroon clownfish receive shelter and a safe nest site. Both benefit from their interaction. In fact, While the bubble tip can live with up to 14 species of clownfish, this partnership is so important to the maroon clownfish that it can't survive without a bubble tip anemone host. Let's take a closer look. Imagine you're a biologist exploring the relationship between bubble tip anemones and maroon clownfish in the Philippines. You visit the same coral reef every year and sample only bubble tips that host maroon clownfish. Look over your field notes now. What trends do you see? How are the populations of these two coral reef residents connected? Take a moment to pause the video and examine the table. Let's hear from Academy scientist Luis Rocha.
When diving around coral reefs, we always find maroon clownfish living in pairs with their bubble tip anemone hosts. You can see this 2-to-1 population ratio in your field notes. Understanding this relationship allows us to make predictions about the population of maroon clownfish based on what we know about the population of bubble tip anemones.
Now imagine you travel back to the same reef to continue your research. What trends do you notice over the following 2 years? Given what you know about this mutualistic relationship, can you predict the effect this drop on bubble tip anemones will have on
16 and 12.
populations?
Good job.
16.
Epic.
The increase in temperature caused.
In this example, extreme temperatures led to a decrease in anemones. And given what we learned it's important to keep in mind that this is just a theoretical example. Natural coral reef systems are very complex and involve a wide variety of factors that need to be taken into account.
Exploring further, we find another example of cooperation among reef residents. This white-tipped reef shark sits peacefully while a blue streaked wrasse swims around its head and mouth. Why so calm? The white-tip has come for a cleaning, and the wrasse, which feeds on dead skin, is happy to provide it. Relationships like this one are so beneficial, the positive impacts spread across the entire coral reef system. Cleaner fish attract a wide diversity of fish to their cleaning stations, and as a result of their cleaning care, improve the overall health of the reef. Not all interactions on the coral reefs are win-win, however. Take the saber-toothed blenny. It looks like a wrasse, but instead of providing a beneficial cleaning, it usually takes a bite from its client's body. This parasitic relationship means one organism benefits while the other is harmed. Passing overhead, a slender fish clings to the side of a whale shark. Remoras like this one live directly on other fish, feeding on discarded food without negatively impacting their host. This relationship benefits one without affecting the other, which is why we call it commensal. On a coral reef, species interactions and the various symbiotic relationships that arise from them are fundamental to the functioning of the entire ecosystem. Understanding these interactions allows us to predict patterns of diversity and, most importantly, come to a better understanding of these biologically rich cities under the sea.
Beautiful stuff. The one thing, and what's interesting to me about the film, so hopefully you have a definition, but we're going to look at a couple things here in a second. But this one, where we're talking about the trends between the clownfish and anemone and trying to predict the population, the math is really simple there. But what I like about the example is you'd be very hard-pressed in ecology to find examples where you affect the population of one species and it has no effect on any other species, because all of these relationships are intact. And so if you affect one organism that's in a commensal relationship with somebody else, it causes these sweeping effects. So in that case, they showed an abiotic change in the environment, which was temperature of water, and it reduced, there might have only been one species that was susceptible to that reduction, but because they both benefit, when one species goes down, they both go down. And so we see that sort of thing a lot. Here is all of that table and information kind of explicitly, and it's fairly easy to understand, but I wanted to give it to you with some simple examples so that when you see more complex examples, you'll be ready to navigate them. Competition we've talked about a lot. We just looked at it with the 2 bacteria species, but when 2 species are competing, it's negative for both, and the data held true. But when we put the 2 organisms in the carrying capacity for each was reduced. So because of competition, we have negative effects for both. A great example, one of the most obvious, is just plants competing for sunlight. It's a resource that is abundant, but it's not granted for each, and one will eventually outcompete the other. It will survive. But during that time when they're competing, both species experience negative effects. The second, the one that we've talked a lot about, predation and prey. That one's fairly easy. One key distinction between this and the next one, parasitism, because they're both positive, negative. The distinction is predator-prey relationship is when it's part of an intact food chain or somebody is eating somebody else. The parasitism is usually it's in the benefit that the host survives, but they are experiencing some negative effects. And then the last one, our last two, mutualism, like the example, and you hear that as a synonym of symbiotic relationship, meaning they both benefit. So that word is used kind of interchangeably. But plants and their pollinators, hummingbirds is a really good example. Bats, bees, insects, and then the complex ones like they gave in the video. And then commensalism. There are a lot of examples of commensalism where one person benefits or one species, benefits, and the other one is totally neutral. It doesn't matter if they're there or not. Just because that's true, just because one organism is neutral doesn't mean there wouldn't be changes in the ecosystem if you remove this, because even though this organism is neutral, there's probably a predator-prey relationship or another competitive relationship. So species are in relationships in many complex ways. Make sense?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful stuff. All right, that's all I have for today.